Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest installment of Office Hours with Dr. John Kelly. We have a very special guest today with Celeste Malone. She's the president-elect of the National Association of School Psychologists, among many other things. And I'll let John do the proper introduction, but I did want to acknowledge that she's here with us, has a lot of great things to share. You guys didn't come here to hear from me, so let's just move along. Just quickly want to touch on the agenda today. We've gone to a new format. Most of you are probably familiar. If we could just jump to the next slide real quickly. We're going to do a quick intro. We won't even be 5 minutes. Let's get into the heart of the presentation. You're all here to see John and Celeste, so let's get to that. And then there'll be an ensuing discussion. And I want to remind everyone of a couple of things. One, we've got a Q&A coming, so we've got a chat. So if you have questions during this, please drop them in the chat and we'll come back to them in this last section of the presentation. Also wanted to remind each and every one of you, Zoom does have live transcript capability, closed captioning. If you have a hearing impairment or are with someone who does, please feel free to utilize this feature. It's at the bottom menu of your Zoom screen. So just go there. And last but not least, I want to remind everyone that this is being recorded. So if you have to leave for whatever reason, we will be sending out a link to the recording. We've noted that many more of you are watching the recorded presentation. So that will be available as well as the deck and any other resource materials. Next slide, please. Last but not least, for any of you who have not been to one of our webinars before, we are Illuma, and we are dedicated to supporting special education and mental health in schools. If you'd like to learn more about us, visit us at Illuma Therapy on Twitter or facebook.com/Illuma Therapy / or if you just want to learn about our company, just go to illuma.com. But last but not least, if you like this webinar, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, because again, we've got plenty more coming your way. So without any further ado, let's turn the time over to John and Celeste. Thank you both.
Well, thank you, George. As I always say, each and every week that we gather for office hours, I just want to again acknowledge and thank you personally for all your support, and certainly Illuma for sponsoring these conversations. It has been a wonderful series, starting out with my good friend Charles Barrett, Byron McClure, hearing from some true experts within the field. We are coming to a close with Dr. Malone tonight, and then Dr. Katie Eklund for next week. We'll close out the series, but don't you worry, we shall be back. We'll be coming back with lots of new topics. We're in the planning phases right now, so I'm excited to continue these conversations. But tonight is an important conversation. Tonight is one of those conversations with Dr. Celeste Malone that is, for me, extremely relevant as a mental health provider. And I think it's important that I kind of put some of this into the proper context before I let Celeste kind of take over and kind of present some big ideas on culturally responsive mental health services. You see, Celeste is a friend. Celeste is a colleague. We have worked together at the National Association of School Psychologists. Celeste is a professor at Howard University, a proud professor, HBCUs, and really promoting school psychology for students that need to know that school psychology is a viable option for them, students that we need to bring into the field, really students of color. And Celeste, you are truly a leader in that way. As you heard George mention, Celeste is the incoming president for the National Association of School Psychologists, taking over as of July 1. And I think that, quite honestly, we are poised for some significant change under Celeste's leadership. But tonight is one of those conversations. I said at the beginning that I'm inviting you to come on in and listen to conversations that we often have. And tonight is one of those conversations that we do often have, but we often don't have out in public. Because there's certain acknowledgments, there's certain recognitions that we need to make. And so, you know, struck just the other day, there was an article that came out in a major psychology publication. I'm not going to name the publication, but it's talking about the founders of modern day psychology. And quite honestly, I was struck by the photo that was on the cover of this article. And it was, quite honestly, it was three old white men. One of them who quite honestly, and please, I'm not trying to say that they were, you know, racist or anything, but one of them who actually developed his theory of psychology as apartheid was growing in South Africa, and this is where he was located, was in South Africa. And it reminded me of a passage I read, and I actually went back and found it, and I'm going to read it to you. Forgive me for reading, but I'm going to read this passage to you, because I think for me, this is what we have to talk about tonight. It indicates that psychology has traditionally been Eurocentric, or simply put, it derives from a white middle-class value system. As a result, mainstream psychology has largely been ethnocentric in its orientation, training, and application, and has neglected the mental health concerns of other racial groups and the socio-political realities that they endure on a daily basis. There is compelling need to develop different paradigms and models to represent reality from the vantage point of minoritized groups. And I remember reading that and thinking to myself, wow, how have we gotten to this point in 2022 and we're just starting to realize this? And I think about the origins of school psychology and who some of the founders of school psychology were and really what they represented. And again, we're in 2022 and we're just starting to have some of these conversations. But it was interesting because Celeste and I were just speaking before we started and went live. And the reality is these conversations have actually been going on for a while. We just haven't done anything about it. And I think that tonight, my guest, Dr. Celeste Malone, you represent some real possibility for change. I'm excited for your leadership. And I want to turn it over to you to share some of the big ideas about culturally responsive mental health services. So Dr. Celeste Malone.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, as well as presenting that backdrop. I think it's a very important context for us to consider. Where did we get the ideas around what defines mental health? What does good mental health look like? How do we guide people towards mental health? It is very much rooted in culture. And we have to consider whose culture, because everyone does have culture, but we absolutely need to question, where did these ideas come from? What drives our practice? What are the hidden messages that are there? And so that means that we're engaging in culturally responsive mental health, but also looking at culture from a very, very broad lens. And I'm excited to have the opportunity to engage in this discussion and present some background information. There's a definition of culture that is presented on your screen, and I will read it. It encompasses the belief systems and value orientations that influence customs, norms, practices, and social institutions, including psychological processes such as language, caretaking practices, media, educational systems, and organizations, media and educational systems again. So culture clearly has a significant influence on how we identify and perceive experiences out into the world. Oftentimes, though, when we use the term culture in psychology and in education, or just in lay language, it's more so associated with race and ethnicity that are noted here. But as you look at the other categories that are described, we see that culture is a very broad term and encompasses every single aspect of who people are. By no means is this an all-inclusive list of the cultural groups in which someone may be a member, but it is a good starting point, and it highlights the broad nature of culture beyond race and ethnicity. Everybody has culture, But too often, when we think of culture, we're attributing that to those individuals who have minoritized status within those groups, with individuals of privileged identities sometimes saying, well, I don't have culture, or I don't know what my culture is. But that speaks to the privilege, because for those who have privileged identities, and within psychology and in the US context, it's exactly what John described. If we look at white, male, non-disabled, heterosexual, English monolingual, their culture is part of the dominant culture. And because it is considered to be normative, that's what may lead individuals of privileged or dominant groups to believe that they don't have culture, but that's not the case, that their identities absolutely influence the way that they perceive the world. And it's important for individuals of all cultural backgrounds, from minoritized groups, as well as members of privileged groups, to understand the cultural identities that they hold and how they influence their experiences so that they're better able to understand the experiences of students. As I said, culture is important because our cultural group memberships shape how we experience the world. With that, let's take a look at the sociocultural demographics of school psychology. This is from the 2020 NASC, National Association of School Psychologists member survey. And based on that data, we see that school psychology is a profession of primarily white, non-disabled, and English monolingual professionals. While this snapshot is specific to school psychology, these demographics are also true for other school-based mental health areas such as school counseling and school social work, as well as educators and school administrators more broadly, that they are predominantly white, predominantly English monolingual, and non-disabled. This stands in marked contrast to the US K-12 student population. Over half of students in our schools are members of racial and ethnic minoritized groups. Based on Department of Education data, about 10% of students are identified as English learners. But it's important to note that this is an underestimate of the multilingual status of our school population, because this only highlights those who are receiving English learner services. And then 14% of students are identified with a disability under IDEA. But again, this is likely an underestimation of the number of disabled students within our school system. Why does this matter? These categories in and of themselves, they speak to culture, but they're also embedded within a broader system of oppression, that we care about race because we consider experiences of racism. We care about disability because we have to consider what it means to be disabled or non-disabled in an ableist society. Those who hold privileged identities within a cultural group are granted access to opportunity, and that occurs on a systemic and structural level. And that same system then denies opportunities to those of minoritized backgrounds, and they also experience discrimination. Moreover, within education and mental health, we've typically examined culture and diversity from a single axis framework. And that ignores the heterogeneity that exists within cultural groups, as well as making an assumption that social identities, such as race and gender, are standalone in their impact on students, which is not true. We have to consider how identities intersect. And with that, how oppressive systems interact and build upon each other, so that students with multiple minoritized identities are placed at greater risk of discrimination and oppression. Students of minoritized identities often experience oppression through the form of microaggressions. Chester Pierce first coined this term in 1970 to describe the insults and dismissals that he regularly saw inflicted on Black people. Daryl Wing Su, a counseling psychologist who is quoted here, has been a leader in microaggressions research and has expanded that framework to examine the experiences of other racial and ethnic minoritized groups. And other scholars within psychology and education have taken this framework further to include other areas of marginalization. Microaggressions are grounded in implicit bias, our unconscious mental attitudes towards a group. Microaggressions are also constant reminders of a person's second-class status in society, as well as oppressive social hierarchies that exist. They may emerge as a micro-insult, behaviors or comments that convey rudeness or demean a person's identity, For example, a science teacher who only calls on male students in the classroom while ignoring female students. Microaggressions may also come out as microinvalidations, comments or behaviors that exclude, negate, or dismiss the thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of the targeted group. An example of a microinvalidation is talking to a friend or a student going to a teacher, telling them that they've been targeted because of their identity, and then the teacher dismissing that concern. You're overreacting. Did that really happen? And that's invalidating, another microaggression on top of the original one. Students with multiple minoritized identities are likely to experience more microaggressions as they relate to each one of the minoritized identities that they hold, as well as the intersection of their identities. Experiencing microaggressions and other forms of oppression, such as witnessing systemic oppression within schools or in society, can have a deleterious impact on emotional health, including depressive symptoms, negative affect, and lowered self-esteem as individuals from minoritized backgrounds start to internalize oppression and start to believe all of the negative messages that they're receiving through microaggressions, or even through their broader environment. Who deserves resources and who does not? Who has access to fair treatment and who does not? Students start to internalize that, and it impacts their self-esteem. When we consider microaggressions that occur in school settings, and those microaggressions are perpetrated by teachers as well as students, people that minoritized students think care about them, or in the case of teachers, are in a position to evaluate them. Those microaggressions can be especially harmful, and students who perceive discrimination are less likely to be engaged in their classes, have decreased achievement motivation, as well as lowered self-competency beliefs. When we consider the microaggressions that minoritized students experience, coupled with the impact of institutionalized oppression in the form of biased school policies and practices, it's clear that we need to be more attentive to the mental health needs of minoritized youth. But there are a number of structural barriers that prevent them from receiving mental health treatment, and those are noted on your slide. I want you to pay close attention to the three in the middle that I have bolded and highlighted: the lack of diversity among mental health providers, the lack of culturally competent providers, as well as language barriers. And when I say language barriers, certainly for families and communities who don't speak English, but even for those groups that speak English, there can be differences in terminology and how we describe problems that cultural mismatch may make communication challenging. I want to highlight that compared to white students, Black, Latinx, and Asian Pacific Islander students with internalizing concerns are less likely to be referred for community-based or school-based mental health services. Recall what I showed you on the previous slide, that the impact of discrimination and microaggressions typically emerges as internalizing distress. Yet, those students who are experiencing internalizing distress because of the experiences of discrimination and microaggressions are less likely to be referred to mental health treatment. But even when receiving services, students of minoritized backgrounds are at risk of getting lower quality services due to the lack of culturally competent providers. Many mental health providers lack cultural sensitivity and awareness, and as a result, engage in microaggressions in the nature of treatment. Examples of microaggressions that occur within therapy are clinicians minimizing the importance of cultural issues, or accusing clients of being hypersensitive when it comes to cultural issues, or worse still, ignoring the topic altogether. If minoritized clients and minoritized students perceive that clinicians are uncomfortable discussing issues related to culture, they learn that they should avoid bringing up that topic, even though it is clinically relevant. And so because culture may not be discussed in therapy, that means that the client doesn't have the space to talk about everything that is impacting them. And as a result, is not able to receive support and treatment in navigating those circumstances. Using a culturally neutral approach to mental health services ignores students' cultural context, and it minimizes the role that oppression and discrimination play in their lives. That's invalidating. And another form of microaggression on top of the microaggressions they experience in their day-to-day life. When students are coming to us for help, we should be helping them, as opposed to harming them further by engaging in culturally neutral practices and engaging in microaggressions in the course of treatment. But by intentionally addressing culture, that shows that we value the student and that we recognize and accept them in their totality. Within school-based practice, we could take a tiered approach to providing culturally responsive mental health services, starting with the screeners that we use, looking at a dual continuum model of mental health. And what I mean by the dual continuum model is that we're not just looking or assessing for the presence of psychopathology. We're also looking at the characteristics associated with mental well-being. And so mental health or good mental health isn't solely the absence of psychopathology, but it also includes individuals having a store and a reserve of mental health strengths. So as part of our screening processes, we should be examining for both ends, the presence of psychopathology, as well as coping strategies for well-being. But for minoritized students who may be identified based on screening data, we query even further and consider the impact of oppression and discrimination. And we assess for that. By being proactive, we're able to better consider the context that may be impacting students' mental health. At Tier 1, we look at creating positive school racial climates. I highlight racial climates because this is from an article that I published in looking at culturally responsive mental health, and it was primarily on racial and ethnic minoritized youth. But for all students, what we could do at Tier 1, providing school environments in which their identity is affirmed, is a preventive factor, and it promotes positive well-being as well. Looking at Tiers 2 and 3, we can integrate culturally responsive practices in our small group supports for students at Tier 2, as well as individualized interventions at Tier 3 to improve mental health outcomes for minoritized youth. The use of culturally adapted interventions can increase minoritized students' acceptance of and satisfaction with mental health services. Those students who are identified as at risk for mental health problems based on screening data can be provided with supports through manualized interventions at either Tier 2 or Tier 3. But looking at cultural adaptations, it's important for clinicians to work with cultural brokers. And what I mean by cultural brokers are members of the student's cultural community, whether it's in school or out in the community settings, to get feedback on the intervention itself, to make sure that the materials used, the stories, the language, and the concepts are culturally relevant to the student. Also, this review helps to ensure that the intervention is providing preparation to respond to real-life situations that cause students mental health distress, such as experiencing microaggressions. Additionally, when we talk to students about their culture, as getting to know them as part of the rapport building process, we could glean valuable information about their cultural identity, which identities are most salient to them, how it impacts their home life, as well as their school life, and use that information to engage in cultural adaptations to our interventions. For example, cultural adaptations to the Strong Start social emotional learning curricula have been effective in improving students' resiliency and knowledge of SEL skills in a sample of Latinx students. When Strong Start SEL curriculum was adopted for Black boys, they reported an increase in their social emotional knowledge, as well as positive changes in self-regulation and self-competence. When we look at individual services, working with students one-on-one in Tier 3, we see that culturally adapted interventions are appropriate and helpful also. Compared to a control group, clinicians who use culturally responsive cognitive behavioral therapy received higher ratings with regard to positivity, that is, the client's mood about treatment, and smoothness, rapport building earlier on in the process. By getting students buy-in early on and having a stronger therapeutic alliance in the very beginning, that suggests that there'll be greater or better mental health outcomes because it's through the therapeutic alliance that change occurs. And if a clinician is able to strengthen that relationship early on by tapping into the student's culture, again, that student is more invested and interested in the mental health services. For minoritized students, particularly racial and ethnic minoritized students who may endorse negative perceptions of the school climate, report feeling disconnected from school, or if they endorse fewer mental health protective factors, we could provide culturally affirming interventions. These are programs with the goals of amplifying students' cultural identities, developing ethnic pride, and teaching them to value cultural differences. Zooming in a little bit closer on looking at race and ethnicity for racial and ethnic minoritized students, these programs should include elements of racial ethnic socialization. That's how students from minoritized groups, they learn what does it mean to be a member of my racial or ethnic group. That includes exposure to cultural practices, promotion of racial pride, development of knowledge about one's culture, as well as preparation for bias and discrimination. That last one may sound a little bit out of place. Why should we be preparing students for experiences of bias or discrimination? That serves as a protective factor. Because when students are aware that they may experience discrimination based on the identities they hold, when it does happen, they are less likely to assume that this is something related to them personally, or something that they did, or there's something about their identity that is flawed. But by being prepared for it, they're able to recognize that this isn't about me, but this is about someone's biases towards me, and they're making assumptions about my group membership. And they're able to externalize the cause of their mental health distress as opposed to internalizing negative messages. By engaging in culturally affirming interventions, we're looking at culturally relevant ways of coping. And we're able to identify that when we take the time to learn more about students' culture, but then also talking to them about how mental health may be discussed within their families, within their communities. What does their family do to feel whole? What are the practices that they see in their day-to-day life? And how can we bring them into our interventions? Because reflecting back on what John said earlier about the three white men who were touted as the founders of modern day psychology, they brought into psychology their definition of coping and well-being and positive mental health. But by no means are white men the arbiters of what that looks like. Individuals and minoritized communities have been engaged in healing very early on. And so it's important to recognize those traditions as well and bring them into our clinical practices so that the treatments are more affirming to students. It's congruent with their cultural beliefs. It promotes the generalization of the knowledge and skills in treatment, and it's relevant to the problems that they're encountering. Providing culturally responsive mental health requires us to understand ourselves as cultural beings, the identities that we hold, that have led to experiences of privilege, as well as experiences of marginalization, and also considering our intersectional identities so that we better understand the experiences of students. We have to be mindful about the biases that we hold, as well as examine our assumptions about power, voice, competence, and effectiveness. We must also demonstrate cultural competence. That's the ability to interact effectively with people from cultural groups other than your own. The cultural competence is just the start. And while it's important to know about cultural groups, have that cultural knowledge, the term cultural competence has been critiqued because competence implies an endpoint, when there really is no end to our learning about different groups. We can't achieve mastery about different sociocultural groups because there's no way we could know all of their experiences. going back to what I highlighted about intersectionality and looking at the heterogeneity of experiences within cultural groups. That's why we also need cultural humility. Cultural humility goes beyond cultural competence to position us as learners and recognize the students with whom we're working are the experts on their own experiences. And as a result, we should be seeking to learn from them. So learning from students and also learning from families as opposed to making assumptions about their experiences. Cultural humility has 4 components. The first is that personal lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique. That self-awareness that I highlighted earlier. What do you know about yourself? What do you know about other groups? What are the limitations of your knowledge? So again, you're not making assumptions, but we are asking people and we're displaying curiosity about people's culture so we could learn more about them because we have the seed of knowledge, but we also recognize that each person is unique. The next is recognizing and desiring to fix power dynamics and imbalances. That goes back to what I highlighted earlier, that we recognize that the identities that people hold are embedded within broader structures of oppression. And so as a result, we're not just looking at someone as a Black individual, but considering what does it mean to be a Black individual in a society that's racist. But we also understand that these power dynamics are complex. So we have access to social power due to the identities that we hold, but we also have power due to the positions and roles that we play within schools. As school psychologists, school counselors, and school social workers, there is power in the title that you have. So how does that title and positional power overlay with the identities that you hold? As such, that you could have 2 colleagues in the same role, but one holds more power than others because of the privileged social identities that they have. But we also seek to address those power dynamics and imbalances and create a more egalitarian playing field. That means being very transparent about the work that we are doing with students and families and providing full disclosure, not assuming that we are the experts. I've moved away from saying that, and it kind of grates me when people say that school psychologists, we are the experts when it comes to mental health. We need to change that framing and recognize that we hold specific expertise when it comes to school mental health. But at the end of the day, the students and families with whom we work, they are the experts on their own lives. And that's a powerful reminder to us. The next point is a desire to engage in partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. So that means that we don't jump in and take the lead on systemic change. We recognize that there are other groups who likely have been leading this charge. Going back to what John said about school psychology and school mental health, really now we're getting more traction around culturally responsive practices. But this conversation has occurred in the past and has been occurring a long time within our profession. And so just because you learned a little bit of something doesn't mean that you are the best person to take charge. By being humble, we recognize those who've been doing this work long before us, and we work in partnership with them, and we seek to learn from them. And then finally, we hold our institutions accountable. So that means that we're engaging in social justice advocacy for broader systems change. We use the power that we have based on our social identities, as well as our positions within schools, to create more affirming environments that will help to prevent mental health problems in the first place. So to close, how do we become a more culturally responsive clinician? Again, it's important for us to be aware of our culture and our worldview. How have our cultural identities shaped our experiences of the world? What are the privileges that we have? Because we all have some areas in which we are privileged. Identity is complex and multifaceted. So we have to consider the multiple identities that we hold and tap into what identities have granted us privilege and which identities have led to experiences of marginalization. And by recognizing the complexity of identity, We can approach others' cultural experiences with genuine interest and curiosity because we recognize that even within the same cultural group, individuals will have different experiences. We recognize that how we were taught or our approach or understanding of mental health and well-being is not the only one. And so we gain knowledge about other practices. We acknowledge cultural differences. We don't ignore them. Difference is not inherently bad, but we have to respect the differences that exist. When we ignore them, we're practicing from a culturally neutral standpoint, and that's a microaggression and invalidating. We develop our communication skills to interact with sensitivity, that we don't go charging in and expecting people to tell us everything about their cultural group without doing homework and our due diligence ourselves. And then finally, we modify treatment to meet cultural needs. And so with that, I am very much looking forward to engaging in conversation with John a little bit further about what culturally responsive practices look like in schools.
Wow. Wow. I mean, there's just so much. I gotta dive into some of this, Celeste. I'm gonna kind of jump right into it. If you don't mind, stop to share your screen and we'll just kind of have some conversation on this. So I want to pick right back up where I left off and actually reread the last line of that quote that I shared. There's a compelling need to develop different paradigms and models to represent reality from the vantage point of minoritized groups. And that, for me, speaks volumes. And listening to you tonight talk about the concepts that you just shared with us, it's just so powerful, to be honest with you, Celeste. And for me, there are two things. One, in my own work, I try to acknowledge my privilege as a white male, and recognize the privilege that I hold and how I can use that privilege, not deny it, not feel defensive about it, but how can I use that privilege to really elevate voices, to be able to affect change and allow others to take leadership roles, to be able to speak from what I call an authentic point of view. And it comes from one of the concepts that you talked about in terms of cultural humility. And I remember being exposed to that a few years back. And for me, it was a game changer because it was really, I had to adopt that cultural humility to say, I need to learn. For me to change, I need to learn from others. Mm-hmm. And so you talk about culture, and let's kind of start there. Mm-hmm. You really offer a wonderful definition at the very beginning of your big ideas. And it's a broad definition. It's not just based upon race or ethnicity or gender. Why is it important to kind of adopt that broad definition of culture as we talk about culturally responsive practices?
Yeah, and that's a great question because you're right. There's often an emphasis on race and ethnicity, gender as well. Reason being, these are the categories of identity and culture that are most visible. So you can't look at someone and know their sexual orientation. You can look at someone and make it's to a degree, it's still somewhat of an assumption of what their racial group membership is or their gender or gender identity. But that's what we respond to. That's what happens within schools and our day-to-day interactions, because this is an aspect of identity that is readily visible and has had a profound influence on laws, structures within our society and education in particular. So it's easy to gravitate solely towards that. But at the same time, it ignores all of the other influences that our other identities have on our life. We're influenced by our country of origin. We are influenced by our religion, or if we don't have religious beliefs, what does that mean in a predominantly Christian society? All of that has a bearing on who we are. And so that's why it's important to take that broader look. One framework that I really gravitate towards to better understand culture as an individual, but then also for others, is Pamela Hayes's addressing framework. Addressing is an acronym. It stands for 10 cultural identifiers that are most salient in the US. Age, disability, both acquired and developmental, religion, ethnic identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, indigenous status, nationality, gender, and gender identity. And those were the cultural identifiers that Pamela Hayes found were most salient within the United States. But from those 10 identifiers, there's a myriad of combinations that someone can have. And so by using frameworks like that, it's important to have these structured tools just to start conversation and to prompt self-reflection. Because again, we've primarily been told that culture is around race and ethnicity. And because we focus on culture from race and ethnicity, it's typically white individuals that will say that I don't have culture when that is not true, that whiteness itself is part of a cultural experience. And to be a member of the dominant racial group, that comes along with things as you highlighted. But very rarely do individuals of dominant or privileged groups have to think about what that means because they just see it's considered to be normative. And so doing that self-reflection and looking at culture in a broad sense challenges what we consider to be normative. And even those things that we consider to be normative aren't necessarily true for everyone's identity from dominant backgrounds. And so just taking that more nuanced look. I think I addressed your question. I think I covered it.
100%. I mean, it leads me into a whole nother areas, quite honestly. I mean, I love that concept of the acronym addressing and really looking at culture in once again, that very broad way. And quite honestly, Celeste, I think that it taps into something else you talked about in terms of intersectionality and the importance of acknowledging and recognizing intersectionality as we talk about mental health services. I honestly believe that intersectionality is not well understood within the field of mental health in general, and maybe even within school psychology. So, help us understand just a little bit more of why intersectionality is such an important concept as we talk about mental health services.
Sure. And so intersectionality, you're right. It's something that's not really addressed in psychology, not really addressed in education. And then when it comes up, it's usually referring to what may be called shallow intersectionality. And shallow intersectionality is solely looking at the multiple cultural groups that someone is a member of. And using myself as an example, okay, intersectional identity as a Black woman. And that's the surface level, just solely looking at my race and my gender. But intersectionality, truly, it's looking at systems of power and oppression. So not just what does it mean for me, my intersectional identity as a Black woman, but specifically the intersection of racism and sexism. That's what intersectionality truly looks like. It's about those systems in which those identities are embedded and how they may lead someone to experience even more marginalization or even more privilege. So continuing to use myself and experiences as an example, as a Black person, people will assume that there is a homogenous Black experience and that all Black people experience the same thing or experience discrimination in the same way. And that is not true. My experiences of discrimination as a Black woman are going to be different than that from a Black male, because it's not just racism or sexism in isolation, but there are specific forms of discrimination or ways that I may be excluded or receiving negative messages from society, specifically as a Black woman, which means that my experiences related to sexism, there are going to be some in common with white women. But again, because white women are privileged with regards to race and sex and their gender, they experience sexism there, still they don't have to contend with racism either. And so with an intersectional perspective, we recognize these more unique nodes of identity and to really focus on who are the individuals who are experiencing the greatest amount of marginalization and as a result, placed at the greatest risk of harm. Going back to myself as an example, I am a cisgender Black woman. And so when we think about, instances of police violence, the uprisings in 2020 sparked by the murder of George Floyd, it was first looking generally at violence towards Black people. But Black women experience greater violence in society from both police violence as well as violence in other arenas. And so that's an intersectional perspective. But even going further, looking at gender identity, Black trans women are at the greatest risk of experiencing both police and sexual violence. And so even though I experience marginalization as a Black woman, I still hold more privilege in that regard than a Black trans woman. And so how do I be a better ally for someone who is in a shared cultural group, but is experiencing greater marginalization? And so we go further and drill down, what is it that we need to do to make our environment safe for those who experience the greatest marginalization due to having those interlocking systems of oppression, multiple minoritized identities? When we make it better for those who are most marginalized, everyone benefits. And so it's not just looking at what's best for me, but ultimately what is best for Black trans women or Black disabled women. That should be the starting point. And so again, looking beyond the identity categories themselves, but those identity categories mean something because they're either lead to privilege, marginalization, and that becomes multiplied when we consider the intersections.
So let me ask you this, as we think about a narrow view of culture and not acknowledging intersectionality, how does that impact upon the provision of mental health services, particularly for minoritized students?
Yeah, we could miss those students who are really experiencing harm. And so just a plug for the NAS book, Best Practices in School Psychology, when that comes out, I think sometime next year, I wrote the chapter on using intersectionality for direct services and advocacy. And so from an intersectional point, it also shapes how we look at some of our screening data in schools. So we typically look at data based on single categories. So we may disaggregate it by race and then look to see who's the lowest performing or needs the most support. A separate analysis disaggregating by gender and identifying who needs more support, and then by sexual orientation. And so that gives us an incomplete picture though, because we recognize, all right, well, within this group, within this one category, such as race, gender, or sexual orientation, there's one subgroup that has lower outcomes. But within that group, those experiences are not the same either. Mm-hmm. So let's take school discipline, for instance. We know that Black students, male students, disabled students, and sexually minoritized students have greater risk for exclusionary discipline. And so as a result, we may have more school-based programs to support their behavior and mental health needs for those respective groups. But it ignores the heterogeneity that's there, because when we look at girls, girls are often left out of that equation because they don't get suspended as frequently as boys. But from an intersectional analysis, Black girls are suspended more frequently than every other group of girls, a racial group of girls, as well as every other racial group of boys, with the exception of Black boys. For sexually minoritized girls, they are disciplined more than their heterosexual girls, as well as heterosexual boys. And so if we solely looked at one aspect of identity, those are two groups of girls that would be totally ignored, because if we just look at an analysis of girls, okay, well, we don't need to do anything for them because boys are getting suspended more frequently. Or it's poor resource allocation, that we're doing all of this for sexually minoritized students when it's really sexually minoritized girls that need the most support. And so by taking an intersectional perspective, it helps us to better identify those students and those groups who are in the greatest need, as opposed to just looking at an incomplete picture.
So Celeste, it really causes me to really reflect and think. You talk about two very important concepts when you talk about culturally affirming and culturally adapted interventions. And I think about my work, I think about the work of our colleagues in the schools or mental health field in general. Let's talk a little bit more about culturally affirming, culturally adapted interventions, and how we really fit it within that MTSS framework that we often talk about. Can you share thoughts on that a little bit more?
Sure. And so starting with culturally adapted interventions, By virtue of just even saying the phrase culturally adapted interventions, that's an acknowledgement that the interventions that we use in schools were designed for a very specific and narrow student population,
Right.
primarily white, non-disabled, heterosexual, cisgender, middle-class students. And the fact that we have to adapt them to meet other cultures, again, suggests that they weren't developed for them in the first place, which would impact their effectiveness. So for any students with whom we're working, we always have to consider when we're looking at the research, well, what works? Okay, this worked, but for whom? And so the more different our students are than what's described in the research sample, the more cognizant we need to be about seeing whether or not this intervention will be most effective and what is it that we need to do to make it more culturally relevant and salient. And we can do that within a lot of our existing intervention packages. Not saying that you have to go out and do something new, because the other part of the reality is that from a package standpoint, due to those issues of our profession, it's not like you're readily finding culturally adapted interventions for sale anyway. And so we're using those initial principles of social emotional learning, of looking at positive school climates, but then we also look at them with a critical eye, right? Do they consider equity? Do they address culture? And if not, how can we incorporate that in there? Because when we fail to do so, all we're doing is recreating those oppressive hierarchies that hurt students in the first place. And so I think it's just going into it with that lens of what is it that we know about the groups of students that are in our schools? And I think that's something that school psychologists and educators should be cognizant of, period. Know your student population, know the community in which they're embedded, because that provides you with some foundational knowledge to think of, does this make sense for this group of students? And that's when you use tools such as the addressing model to learn more about the students that you're working with, because you may know some generic characteristics about them, such as, okay, this is a Black male student because you're looking at them, but you don't know about the impact of religion or socioeconomic status or disability, those other aspects. And so we ask about it so we could get a more nuanced understanding. And then we bring that into our discussions and refer back to it often, asking students if these things make sense, asking students if this is similar to what they've learned before, or if they could see the relevance of it in their day-to-day lives. That's an important piece. And then for the culturally affirming interventions, that for students, we mandate, we have compulsory education laws that make students have to attend school. But for minoritized students, school can be a very oppressive and toxic environment for them due to the regular experiences of microaggressions, the seeing unfair practices around discipline or dress code or other school policies, and it makes it really aversive. And they're receiving these negative messages about their cultural group. And so while they may not identify any mental health concerns, if we see that there's some students who have fewer mental health strengths or feel more disconnected from the school environment, that tells us something, that in some way they're having an experience in school that makes them feel excluded or not belonging. And so culturally affirming interventions, creating these spaces within schools that are intentional about celebrating culture, where students of a similar cultural identity can come together and talk about what does it mean to be a member of this cultural group. And the adults in that space teaching them about their cultural strengths, because all too often for individuals in minoritized backgrounds, it's often highlighted the fact that they've experienced oppression. Now that we're getting more cultural awareness in schools, we really hone in on these oppressive experiences. And this is why we need to help these kids, without recognizing that their cultural groups have a lot of strengths as well and ways of healing that aren't readily talked about. But when we create spaces for students to learn about them, because they may not have learned about them before, about the strengths of their group, but we create those spaces for them to learn about their cultural groups, to feel affirmed as members of that group, and to highlight the positives of it, and to develop that sense of pride, and offering that in school, it's twofold. That one, they have the benefits of participating in the group, but the fact that it happened in school, it sends the message that, hey, this school recognizes and acknowledges who I am. And they see that me and other people in my cultural group, we need this type of boost. We need this space. And that creates a greater sense of connectedness to the school environment because they're recognizing that school is a place where they can get the unique supports that they need.
I don't know how it happens, Celeste. We are
I was looking at the
I feel like I
clock
just
also.
started this conversation with them. Like, no, I don't want, to come to a close, but we're not. I apologize to the audience. We're gonna go on for just a little bit, but I do want to acknowledge we're running up against the time. Celeste, I don't want to end the conversation without kind of the last piece that you had talked about and talked about the big ideas. And that's kind of some of our own work as clinicians. And I kind of acknowledged before, again, my own privilege and my own journey in terms of cultural humility and how important I really felt for me that was. And I know that lots of our colleagues want to do this work, that want to be part of the change that we all acknowledge needs to happen. So the sense of self-reflection, can you kind of share just a little bit more? Why is that so important when it comes to culturally responsive practices?
Sure. We have to understand ourselves before we can really understand the experiences of others. And with that, just our own worldview, because it's not just understanding ourselves, but our cultural identities, they're like the lens through which we view the rest of the world. And so as a result, we're interpreting students' behavior based on expectations that are culture bound. And so when we think about problems in school, a problem in that strict behavioral definition, a problem is a discrepancy between what's expected and what's observed. What is shaping your expectations? And we often don't reflect on that. How is it that we think that students should be acting in school? What makes for a compliant student or a smart student or a well-behaved or well-adjusted student? All of that is based on the cultural messages that we receive. If we don't examine those, though, we can't check ourselves or each other for that matter to see if we're penalizing students or looking at them through a more oppressive lens. That do we have biases, negative messages around particular groups? Because going to what I mentioned before around when we look at identity within systems of oppression and marginalization and how we develop that sense of identity. Individuals from privileged backgrounds, because they've regularly experienced or given advantages, it's like, okay, well, we deserve this. And because these other minoritized groups, they're not getting it, they must be less than. I must be getting it because there's something better about my group, and other groups don't get it because there's something negative or inferior about them. So building their identities at the expense of others. And for minoritized individuals, internalizing those negative messages. I guess I don't get those opportunities because there's something that's not deserving of my group. We pick up these messages early on, and we bring them with us every single day that we go to work, whether or not we acknowledge it. And so when we don't acknowledge it, we're at risk of acting on our unexamined biases, which may mean having negative perceptions of students from certain minoritized groups, denying them opportunities, assuming that there's something wrong with them as opposed to something wrong with the system. And that affects how we even enact change. So it's important for us to know ourselves, how we view the world, because it shapes how we view others, and it better positions us to really be curious about the experiences of others, because we know that we're complex. And so we'll go into this knowing that students and families are complex with their identities also.
Yeah, it reminds me of conversations I have with another one of our colleagues, Dr. Stacy Williams, who has always, on personal, challenged me to really reflect, to engage in that self-reflection, and really acknowledge that's one of the first steps we need to take if we really want to make some changes. And I hope that we're at a point in our profession, certainly within the larger mental health field, where we're engaging in more of this self-reflection. I honestly believe we've been forced to because of many events that have happened around us. And I think that if we don't change, we are really losing a significant opportunity to do the work we want to do and better the lives of all children that we want to work with. So I think that that's important. Celeste, I want to bring George back in. I know we have a couple of comments, questions from the audience. I do like to acknowledge them. So George, if I can ask you, I can certainly bring up the chat box, or if you wanted to bring up the chat box.
Got it right here.
Go ahead.
So we've got a couple of questions here. The first one is, and I don't have a name, I just have DP. So I'm trusting this, and it doesn't appear this person is with us anymore. But let's go ahead and ask it anyway. This conversation is so important. So starting with compliment, thank you, Celeste, and agree with all the points you made. Question, how do we bring those providers who need to hear this the most to the table, or help them engage with this material and respond to the resistance? NASP, as one example, only has a percentage of the total school psychologists in practice. How can those who hear this message today bring change to their buildings, districts, communities, regions, and states?
Okay. So my response is twofold. Addressing the second question first, how can we bring this message further? It's sharing it with your colleagues. Tell a friend to tell a friend to tell a friend. That I would encourage you to watch this video as a group or a mental health team, so that you could have some conversations about what does this look like in your school? What are your areas of growth? What are the tension points for your respective setting? And so the biggest thing is about sharing it. But then how do we get people on board who are more resistant? That's where that advocacy piece comes in, because people are right. Those who are here made an intentional choice to be here. No one forced you to do so. But the reality is that we have many within our professions, school psychology, counseling, social work, and education, who, to be blunt, really have no business being with kids. And I certainly would not want them. And I think that, and I could think of people in my field that I would not want them working with kids of color at all. But yet they need this training and they won't go to it voluntarily. And that's where that advocacy piece comes in around our credentialing, our requirements. So making, from graduate education standpoint, more robust standards around diversity and social justice training in our graduate programs. All of our respective professional associations require it to some degree. I think where all of them fall short is not requiring specific courses or outcome data specific to looking at diversity and culturally responsive practices. We need to do better in that regard and really look at the intensity and intentionality in which it's covered in graduate programs and strengthen our accreditation standards to evaluate that. But then for those who are in practice, looking at our credentialing systems, taking licensed psychologists as an example, there are multiple states that have moved to require diversity continuing education units. Virtually for all of our professions, ethics is required as a condition of certification or licensure renewal, but many places are now requiring diversity credits as well. And I think in my state of Maryland, where there was a huge hubbub about it, don't tell me what to spend my PD money on, but it's making sure that you're adequately prepared to serve the public. And that's why these professional associations should take a stronger stance in that regard. I'll highlight NASP because it was mentioned in the response, but for national certification, a change that was recently made was a requirement for diversity credits in addition to ethics. And so some may just do their required 3, some may do a whole lot more, but at a minimum, we know that we're increasing exposure and using that as a starting point.
And I'm just going to add in there, and again, using myself as an example where, if you're a person that has privilege, if you're a person that has power, we have to use that to have these conversations. There's going to be resistance, but coming from a position that I'm in, coming from the power that I do hold, we need to be able to engage in these conversations. And so I think, in addition to what Celeste offered there to overcome some of that resistance, it's going to take individuals who have that privilege, who have that power, to engage in the conversations, elevate the voices. I don't need to be leading this conversation, but I do need to use my power and privilege to elevate the voices that do need to be heard. And I think that that's critical.
Okay, we've got one more question here from Shannon V. Ryan, and then I think we've probably got a wrap soon. But the question is, I work in school mental health research, Any recommendations for valid measures we can use to assess the cultural acceptability and relevance of EBIs being implemented?
Yeah, so, and that's a tough one, because they are going to look quite different because it's going to be adapted. That said, there are some frameworks to look at engaging in culturally responsive or adapted interventions, how to go about the process. And I think you could use that as a checklist of how did we go through each of those respective steps. The other part about it is looking at treatment acceptability after the treatment was done. So we know that there are regular treatment acceptability measures in use that we're asking people, did they believe that this was effective, that it was helpful, adding questions specifically around culturally congruent. Does this reflect or prepare me to address the problems that I experience? Did I feel like my culture was reflected in the materials that were used? Because there's nothing that, to my knowledge, that is specific to assess that. But that also goes back to the larger issue that was highlighted in the beginning about why it doesn't exist, because psychology is a predominantly white field. And so those measures really haven't as much been developed. It hasn't been as much of a focus, but we can just ask people whether or not it met their cultural needs and using existing treatment acceptability measures. I believe the slides will be shared. If it's possible, I'm happy to share the article that I highlighted in my presentation where I presented a culturally responsive model for mental health MTSS and do talk a little bit more in depth about how to engage in cultural adaptation.